I'm looking at the what's that? A bear with its being bitten by a fish. What's that?
Here,
Yeah,
it's a
it's a
it's a white tiger and a great white shark,
okay.
and then what do they call that? It's almost like the same symbol. I don't think I have it on the wall behind me, but it's almost the same as the symbol for a perfect circle, the band A Perfect Circle, where it's
Okay.
they took a perfect circle and then they offset it just a little bit like that.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So yeah, I've
So
learned
how,
that
how
was done by the artist Beeple, for the organization called Nature is Metal, which is a I guess they're mostly an Instagram channel, but it's all animals eating other animals, things like that. Natural disasters, basically, like the name implies, nature is metal. It's all the destructive nature of nature, I guess you would say.
right, right. Um, I like your beard. My beard was not as long as yours, but had the same shape. And I went to my beard master, I will call him, and he turned out to be not a beard master because he made it shorter than I wanted it to be. But
I
anyway,
had the same story when I first moved here. I needed a trim, didn't know any barbers, talked to a couple people in town.
you were telling me that story, right?
Yeah, and then so yeah, I end up breaking down. I did it myself and I just massacred it. I cut off way too much, so I let it grow out again. And then I went to a barber because everyone was telling me this guy knows what he's doing. And so I'm talking to him, and as I'm talking to him, I'm starting to realize I don't think he knows what he's doing. And then his first clipper swipe, I was like, oh, he definitely does not know what he's doing. So
Yeah,
I've been
this
growing it back out.
nice. I was at the gallery 2 days ago. Well, let me tell you, I just finished curating a show which took 2 years to do. When I curate shows for 12 months, we meet once per month and have conversations, me and the artist and I. And they have a journal. She has a journal, makes notes, jottings. She's a fabric artist, so I know at one point she had a piece of fabric attached to stapled to the page. And the next 12 months, I visit her studio once per month to see what progress is being made. And then at the end of that 12-month period, I get works which I think are representative of the whole body of work she has done. And I mount the show. And so that opened on the 29th of January, ran till the end of February. And the show is very affecting because it's about Alzheimer's. Her mom, who turns, I think, 87 in June, and her husband, who I think is 64, both have it. And it's interesting because the 12 months of conversation, we never once mentioned Alzheimer's. I began talking to her about what's on your mind, what's bothering you, because I find that that's a good way to get at what you're dealing with presently. As an artist, or any kind of work you're doing, you can get into a routine which has a lot to do with convenience, in that it places food on the table. But very often, that routine leads you away from what's here. And I find that if you begin, I was having a conversation with her about 5 years ago. There's a guy named Kirk Merker. He's an artist. He's from Hamilton, but he's been living in Nevis on and off. Like he winters here, spends half the year here. For more than 20 years. I've been here now for 18 years, and he's been here. And we were in his gallery speaking. And I noticed just from her body language that she was saying something physically that was not being articulated verbally. And what it was, I am kind of reluctant to approach something. So the first show was, I said, like, what's bothering you? And it turns out it was sibling rivalry. And from that came up. And so for this show, I said, like, what are you dealing with? And now this artist, like me, she's from here. She went to Toronto with her parents in the 70s. And we both went to Toronto School of Art, but not at the same time. And ironically, she has her husband and her, they have one child who is in Toronto. And she refuses to be tested to see whether or not she has that proclivity for Alzheimer's, because at 38, you don't want to know that. There's some things you'd rather not know. So the show was really, really, really interesting. I bought 2 pieces. And, when I mounted the show, when the show opens, each piece has to be priced. The show ended and about half of them were not priced. And I think when she first told me the price of, what it would be, I wish I had pieces here to show you. It was like, oh, I'll sell it for 200 EC, which would be like 100 Canadian. I'm saying, hold on, you can't do that. Sell it for 200 American. I found out later her sister, who is visiting from Toronto, was doing duty in the gallery, and she was selling, speaking to someone and saying the price. And she said, oh, my mom did this. And at that point, she broke down. So I think the reason why she cannot price anything is that it's a question, how do you put a price on your parents, your mom's suffering, and the possibility of your daughter and your husband? And I remember saying to her sister, she's going to come in one day and just price it. And she said, no, she won't. So the show is over. I took down the show on Tuesday. And on Wednesday, I closed the gallery and mounted a new show. And this is very interesting because the show, she's from Toronto, and she's been coming to Nevis for 25 years, and now she has moved here permanently. This is the woman who came to my house. I was telling you the story of how we're connected, and I bought a little box at the One of a Kind show. And she came up and said, yes, it was made by my brother. And I thought, no, it can't be. I bought it now. Now, her brother has since passed away, which I didn't know. His wife is coming to Nevis for the first time. I think they're flying in on Saturday. That's when the Air Canada arrives. Every Saturday it arrives with these people who say, oh, I can't. You don't know how lucky I am not to be in snow. And they're arriving on Saturday, and she can't wait to meet me. Can't wait to, as in, because what's the likelihood, the connection, the synchronicity of, I'm accustomed to a high degree of synchronicity in my life. Whenever it happens, it's still shocking in some way because it's still incredible. And I've had a passing, I think I mentioned this to you earlier. When I was about 7 years old, I began saying, I'm going to meet this African. And I had a friend, her last name was Israel, from Bulawayo, which is a little town in Western Rhodesia, as it was called then. And she was my next door neighbor. Only in Toronto you can have that kind of. I remember I was having a conversation with her in the late 70s, and she's saying, you're so intelligent, you just seem to be drifting. What's it? I said, well, I'm going to meet an African, and he's going to teach me this, teach me that. This was in maybe 79, and I met him in 81. I spoke to him last, I would call him maybe once a month, once every 2 months. He moved to Jamaica. He's from Ghana. And he moved there, he had married, his kids are from Jamaica. Anyway, I went back and looked at my WhatsApp, and I spoke to him November 2nd, sent him information. And I'd actually spoken to him mid-November. And usually when you send him information, he doesn't respond right away. And then I called in January because I had been getting premonitions. And I specifically called because I had what I call flashes, where I walked into his bedroom. He was lying on a bed. but the bed was shaped like a coffin. I called. There was no answer, which is not unusual. About 2 hours later, I got a call back, and it was from his wife. And she said, he did pass at the end of November. And there's something called Black History Month. He had gifted me a garment which had been given to him by his dad. And I've not worn it. It's an authentic, it's probably almost 100 years old, I would think, because he died in his late 70s. And his parents lived to be, I think, in the 80s. Anyway, and there was, I've not really worn it because to me it's like sacred. And on Sunday, we have this, I don't know why, this Black History Month thing. And in church, I was asked to read a poem because I'm a poet. And I have a friend who is from here, spends time here in New York, and I read a poem. And I wore this outfit for the first time. And I thought it was appropriate. It doesn't fit at all because obviously his dad was much more wide-shouldered, but that was an ending in some way, a profound ending. And I know, I know we still communicate because, as you know, it's like a sign we come into the physical world and go out, but we still retain our consciousness. And if you are cognizant or blessed or lucky enough, you can stay in contact with people who are even no longer in physical forms. He had told me in the early 80s that I would be meeting a particular person. It's a woman. And it's interesting that I met this person. I met her sometime ago, like seen her, and never felt like speaking to her because she seemed unapproachable. Ironically, she told me the same thing. She would pass by the gallery, see me, but somehow I seemed as if I think she said, I needed no one. And in the way that things can happen when in a synchronistic way, which tells you you are on the right path or on the straight or narrow. I'm part of a theater group. I'm vice president and I'm acting director and so on. We had a show early in last year and I saw her go by and I thought, oh. And usually when we have a production, we ask people who we know in the audience, what do you think, to get feedback? And when I saw her after that, it was like 2-3 weeks and I didn't want to walk up to her and I didn't want to think I'm just trying to strike up a conversation, although obviously. And when we were having a show at the beginning of August, I saw her and I said, would you? And it turns out she was happy that I spoke to her. And I found out later that she was in her office. I think she can stay in her office and see as I walk out of the gallery. And she said to a fellow worker, that man is going to be my next boyfriend. And the guy who I didn't know at the time said, oh, he's a nice guy, I can introduce him. It turns out he's a son of a great friend of the theater founder and artistic director. And then one day I was walking to theater and I noticed she was waiting on the bus. And I just happened to look at her and she was looking at me so intently, I could actually feel her looking at me. And every time I became uncomfortable and didn't realize it around that time, she said she doesn't know why she said it. That man is going, because, and I told her this, she obviously likes a guy who was 6'4", which I'm 5'7". And I like women. At one time in Toronto, friends used to call me Mr. 190, because if you're not 190, you're pretty thin. She's not 190. And I pointed out to her, when you have a connection like that, and it's not primarily physical, it's because it's spiritual. There's something else that's the basis of the attraction. That has been profoundly, profoundly, I've had a lot of dealings with a lot of women, but it's like, it's the first time I'm learning and discovering things about myself from being involved with her. And it has been an astonishing experience. I was told I'd meet this particular person. A physical description was given. And she fits that description. And all along, I knew that this particular person would wear a particular item of clothing. And sometimes when I said, do you wear this? It's a straw hat. And her birthday is early December. And she invited me to join her and her kids. She has 4 kids. One is studying in England for a birthday. And, she came, they had gone to church. It was a Sunday. And she came out wearing a straw hat. And I'm thinking, hold on a minute. I do not know any day. It's stuff like that happens to me all the time. But when it actually does happen, it's like strange and weird and wonderful. I say all that not just to gossip about myself, but to show that we are deeply, deeply, deeply connected to each other, not only to each other, but to the planet itself. And I want to give you an illustration of that. Formula One is about to begin, and the guy who is the head of Formula One is from somewhere in Arabia. I think he's a Saudi. What we do not realize and do not fully understand is that the physical earth produces not only human beings, but cultures and languages. He is very, very, very austere. He is very belligerent. He is very stern. It's like in Saudi Arabia, if you mess up, they don't say, oh, if you're going to forget, they chop your hand off or your neck off, And that has to do with the fact, I argue, that the physical world which produces us is that way. It is austere. It is harsh. You go into the desert and you're not prepared. It will cost you your life. And it produces people, human beings who are like that. And the culture, and one way you can really assess this is look at the version of religion which is practiced there. It's Muslim, it's Islam. But in Malaysia, they also practice the same religion. They won't cut your hand off if you make a mistake. Because, and if you look at the physical world in Malaysia or Indonesia, it's much more varied. It's much more, the more varied your physical world, the more sophisticated and subtle your language and more tolerant you can and will be. And this is something I wanted to point out because it's almost as if we go through life in a kind of somnambulism. We are awake, our eyes are open, but at a certain level, we are all asleep. And it's really interesting. Another, and this goes to being, how are we kept asleep? Because I don't think that that's our natural state. I think we're done that by religious indoctrination, education, and I will argue, particularly in the United States, by cartoons. Because I always thought it very, very odd that there's something very odd happening with cartoons. Now, I used to look at I don't have a TV since I came home, so 18 years. And I used to look at The Simpsons because one day I thought it was just a cartoon with a rude, spoiled kid. But one day I just happened to be looking, and some characters are walking down the road and the street, and they're passing an optical shop, and it's called I Caramba, E-Y-E Caramba. And I thought, oh, somebody's thinking. So I started watching it. But if you look very, very closely at what happens with cartoons, and it's almost as if they're providing a substitute for an individual's imagination. And it's very, very subtle. And you can argue, well, with a nation which is that large, you have to have a common ground on which to stand. And you can argue, well, that's one way of doing it. But it's like, why should you imagine and use your imagination when that imagination is taken up by cartoon characters? And I began to think of this when, I think it was when they had Atlanta Olympics, and there was this guy. I still have the image in my head. He's an adult. He's pushing a stroller, but he's wearing this tall hat, which is like red and white, and it's from a cartoon character. I think it's from, I
Waldo?
can't remember. Yes. And it's like, yeah, it's like, how does an adult do that? What kind of state of mind do you have to be in to think that that's okay? Walking down the street with your child, what are you going to teach it? I mean, that's the way I think anyway. So, like your own imagination is subsumed under this, I would say, false or artificial imagination. And I think that to some extent accounts for why we seem to be going through life in a state of not really knowing, not really fully awake. And TV helps in that. And I refer to them as the mischief makers. They're the minions of the Order of the Red Dragon. They're the people Leonard Cohen referred to. There's a song, and he says, he finds himself at the beach of a sea of deep despair, pursued by the riders of a dark and cruel regime. And they're people who are dedicated to making sure that we stay asleep, and they take their work seriously. I was thinking of what you said about magic of, providing a safe place, as it were, for your own vision, your own consciousness. I've been exploring that. And that is so extraordinarily important, because what you don't realize, what most people don't realize, there are people who are aware of that, and they are always on the lookout for who can we use today, And if you're not careful, you find yourself having thoughts which are not actually yours, or thinking things which you've been directed to. And I can't imagine what it will be like, because at some point it has to happen where we come out of this. I think we're entering the dark ages, that we look, the previous dark ages look like a sunny day. Because if you think of the nonsense that, the proponents of this new reset, whatever you want to call it, what they're thinking of having us connected to technology and having the world run by businesses or corporations, which is the classical definition of fascism. We are in for a rough ride. I mean, it's like human, everything we do, there's always the light and dark, the up and down. And a lot of it has to do with how you see it, how you perceive it. But I think that there is a push on, and it's a push born of desperation and blindness and ignorance, to control us. And they're going to discover that it's like the wind. You can't control the wind. You can use it, you can get it to put your sail, and you can get from point A to point B. But you can't control it in the way they would like to. And it's really, I'm like sitting back. I wish I could be like one of those guys, not who lived for 7,000 years, to see them go through and discover, oh my God, we were so effing wrong, man. Because at some point, they're going to have to come to the realization that that's not the way you live on this planet. And you cannot, what people do not realize is that even the people who think that they are in control of nature, as long as you're born of the planet, you are subsumed under its overarching consciousness. It allows room for your ignorance and for your blindness to make you think that you can actually control nature. But sooner or later, we all come to realize that we are dependent on it for survival, not only physical survival, but our consciousness, our spiritual survival.
It's interesting what you mentioned about cartoons, because I mean, the power of that should be evident if you really know the story of Walt Disney, especially the early years and during World War II, because it actually started with him doing cartoons for the United States to get Americans to pay taxes. and it worked. They had like something like a 40% in years, 47% increase, like in 1 year, which is absurd, right? Like that's
Yes.
dramatic. So Hitler saw that and was like, hey, it was awfully effective. Want to make some stuff for me? Walt Disney
Oh,
was
really? I didn't know that.
sure. So he made all the early Nazi propaganda films, like before. And this is something people forget about Nazism. You know, there was a turning point where it became the horrors we know today, right? But before that, it was just a nationalist party, right? It was national.
Right.
They were
Right.
patriots, right?
Yeah.
MAGA, basically, right? So,
Right. No, true.
and yeah, so he used those films and they were highly effective. And then once World War II kicked off, the United States was pissed and actually took over Walt Disney Studios and started getting him to make, or started forcing him to make cartoons for them, right? Anti-Nazi cartoons, because they recognized the significance of it. It's that blur between reality and what we know is not reality, right? Which is the same state when we were dreaming. So by producing that as the public norm, right? And like today it's virtual reality and the metaverse, right? It's that next evolution of that augmented reality, like they were doing with like, say, Pokemon Go and things like that. You know, this is all slowly making us accept imagery that isn't natural, right?
Yes.
To the point where today we don't even notice that our environment is basically not natural. You know, like people don't notice the change in the snow or the change in the rain or the change in the wind or any of these things because they're very subtle. But our imagination is so captured by all of this inorganic stuff that we're not tuned in enough to notice those subtle changes as they go.
And actually, I didn't know about that, about Walt Disney and his connection to the Nazis. Although, you know, there are lots of Americans were influential in the National Socialist Party, in the genetics. And I think at one point Ford, or is it Boeing, or one of those companies were making vehicles for the Weimar. You know, they would fly them across the southern Atlantic to Africa when they paid them as Germans. And, you know, like, hey, listen, as long as there's money to be made.
Yeah, people forget, like just before World War II kicked off, that party was heavily in the United States. They had actually sold out Madison Square Gardens because so many Americans were on board with that party.
Yes.
Right. So that's how, like, people forget. We have a very short memory.
Not only that, I like to say, you know, Germany lost the war, but the Nazis moved their racket to the States. Because when Operation Paperclip and all those rockets going to the moon, they began at Petermonde, I think it's called. You know, and I think Bell Labs was peopled by guys from Germany who were working on the same projects that they came over to the States.
That actually ties into a conspiracy theory because do you know of the Nazi Bell?
Yes.
Right, the Bell experiments, and then there was the Bell organization that came over, right? And again, it's the same thing as, like, I've pointed this out now, back when Gary McKinnon hacked the NASA file, or I guess it was the Navy's files, and found Solar Warden, and was reading all this language, which he interpreted as meaning it was some type of space fleet, like some type of outer space, like, because they were using words like non-terrestrial and things like that, not understanding that non-terrestrial is actually water. And now, you know, with hindsight, we can see that Solar Warden was Space Force, which was, you know, existent now. And that's another similarity where it's like, at the time, when we don't really know all the details, we hear these words and we make these assumptions as to what they mean. And then later on, we find out what they actually meant. So, yeah.
Right. It's one of the things I'm discovering. I listened to Joseph P. Farrell and a guy named Dark Journalist. And, you know, this is after 30 years of reading the New Yorker, the Globe and Mail, Donato in the Sun, you know, and discovering, man, you're being lied to. So, if you want to know that, if you want to know what's happening, you always have to. It's like when you go outside at night and the light, if you want to see something, you have to look just slightly right or left of it and you see it. You know that way? Yeah. If you want to know what's actually going on, you have to try and see what's shimmering in the shadows.
I used to work at a convenience store, and so we would get like, all the different papers in the morning. All of Canadians are our local papers, as well as a couple from the States. And so I would point out to people all the time, I would pull out the sports section and I would get out the write-up of the Maple Leafs game from the night before. And I would just drop that in front of people. I'm like, read them all, because they're all distinctly different, right? If you hadn't actually watched the game and you just read that, you would think 5 different games happened based on these 5 different articles, and that's sports. So imagine what if the outcome actually means something, right?
Right. I actually made notes, and I hope I can read my own handwriting. I spoke about curating. We can do. One of the things I wanted to talk about is the idea that what we call reality is actually a projection of that world, the imagination, the world of the imagination. And I think of ourselves as being magical creatures, in that we have this unusual ability to project aspects of our imagination outside ourselves and then inhabit that projection and make it real via ritual and routine and accepted. Believe, changing fantasy into accepted norms. But not everything that we project outside of ourselves, the same way in which we have human beings who are born and they're born deformed or mentally deficient, we actually do project ideas which are half formed. They're not fully formed. And I like to think of every cult, everything that exists as a cult is a deformed idea. And the standard I use to judge whether or not an idea is fully formed and ready for prime time, as I say, is whether or not you need coercive forces to keep it going. You have to, you do this or else. One of the reasons I'd say that communism and fascism and most cults, some denominations in religions are like that. But you can say, let's take Christianity as a whole, just as an institution, the fact that it's made of the Catholics, the Anglicans, the Lutherans, it has a variety, reflects the kind of variety you see in nature. But cults like those guys in the States, who hold snakes and that's that's a cult. Because once you hear that snake hissing, and it's like, hey, maybe I should have taken up drinking. I think that fascism, communism, and ideas which require a lot of outside force to keep them, to enforce their values or their ideas, are half-baked. And one reason why I respect capitalism is because it is so wide and varied. It makes room for just about anything you want to be. If you want to be a greedy corporate creep, you can do that. You want to give away all your money, you can do that. It allows for a degree of scampishness and tricksterism, which I think is indigenous to the human animal, because it's a way, it's an aspect of ingenuity. It's like people who tell you, hey, I can sell you this. You have beer? Yeah, I have a beer. You have 4%? No, I have 3%. But look, the 3% is actually better for you. Why? I really prefer the 4. No, man, the 3%, I'll tell you what. How much is it? It's 10, but for you, I'll give you for 7. Of course, it's for $3, right? That kind of scampishness is endemic to human beings. It's a kind of tricksterism, and I'm sure it has survival importance, because it's the person who is being, caveat emptor, the person who is being tricked has to develop discernment. You have to know when you're being bullshitted. If you don't, you're going to pay the price. And that, I think, is one reason why capitalism, for all its faults, and there are many, and actually they're not faults, it's just a reflection of the contradictions that being human, project. It's part of the human project, and it will always survive because we are always looking to trade something. You see someone with something, you like it, hey, do you want to exchange? And that's the basis of a very fundamental human interaction. And socialism and communism and fascism, they will always go by the wayside.
Yeah, it's we need a certain amount of darkness, and we can make very seemingly good decisions to remove darkness from things, not understanding the long-term consequences of doing that, right? Like, pain is teachable, right? That's a informative signal, these type of things. When the universe views the buyer and seller of lies as equal, and so we're supposed to learn these things, right? And do better. Unfortunately, what a lot of people nowadays tend to do is kind of adopt the victim mentality of this shouldn't have happened to me, instead of this has happened to me, what should I do now, right? And I think that removing ourselves from nature in the way that we have, and coming up with all these technological situations or solutions, has kind of made us forget that, or and I think that's a definite agenda, because people who don't know that connection are easy to control.
Yes, and it is about control. It is about enslavement. And one of the things there's a guy named Borrow, and he's some high poobah in the EU, and he was addressing some young people who they're training to take over and run the world. And he's telling them, we live in a beautiful garden, and the rest of the world is a jungle, and we have to protect the beautiful garden from it. I'm thinking, man, that's so 19th to 20th century. Like, the kids you're talking to, they're from all over the world. It's that used to be based a long time ago on skin color, and it can't be anymore. I mean, look at the Prime Minister of England. Look at the former, the idea that the world is divided into, what I'm trying to say, that we are at a point where a lot of the assumptions we held dear and sacred no longer hold. And we are in some ways dire straits. It's an opportunity to reinvent ourselves. Now, people like that Santa Claus guy, he wants to persuade us, or rather he's trying to convince us that if we, on his behalf, create through our own volition the world he would like to see, everything would be hunky-dory. But it's up to you and me, and this is something that our listeners might find helpful. How do you invent the world you would like to live in? You do that by, when you go to the shop, you treat the person behind the counter as if you are already living in the world that you would like to live in. You speak to your children that way. You get on the bus and you imagine that the world you would like to live in, not the one that Santa Claus wants for you, already exists. And you are creating it with your actions. And once you have that, because what people don't realize is that we do actually create the world that way, by believing that we exist in it. These guys, and they're very cunning, but not very wise, they know that, and they try to get us to produce the world they want of our own volition. And they do have a degree of success. And I do believe that the music industry is a way in which they can get hundreds of thousands and millions of people saying the same thing. If we all singing the same song that Riri purportedly wrote, or, and emanating emotions out of it, well, that's not too different from them telling us, oh, you have to get this. What do you call it?
Lollipop.
You have to get this lollipop. And then everybody say, yeah, because I needed to fly. I can't fly. No, if you do like that, you will fly. But it's interesting to see the way in which reality is actually created. And that show I did with the Alzheimer's show, one of the things she did was, it's brilliant. I had no input in the what she was doing. I just go to the studio and say, wow. And she had little sculptures. All it is, they're common pins about this long. They're 24 and a piece of magnet, and you just get them to stick in. It creates an image. And it has to do with, like, when you are dealing with someone in cognitive decline, you're constantly on pins and needles. And there are 24 of them because there are 24 hours in the day. And I can testify to that because my dad, who passed away at 92, he died in August, and the May of that year, I spent 3 weeks with him in Toronto East General. And at one point, he began to ask me about the man in the picture on the wall. Now, how do you answer that? Do you humor him? And you look like an idiot because there's no man, you know what I mean? So you're like on pins and needles all the time. And when I like being around creative people, because you see almost daily the way in which reality gets created. Because people who are creative, that's what we all do. But most of us are unaware, and a lot of energy and time is put into making sure we don't realize that we, in fact, are creating the world. So to go back to what I was saying, if you want to live in a world where you're connected to nature, it's an organic world where you have a particular kind of relationship with people, you have to start creating that world through your own actions, and every time you act, every time you create a little object, you're making something which beats upon the membrane of this thing we call reality. You're actually creating reality. And I very often, when you read, I follow this guy, I'm going to stop following him. I get bored quickly. And it's called Inspired Tribe, And there's this assumption that there are a lot of people who follow Donald Marshall. I found out the other day, he's surprise, his Instagram page is no longer around. There's this notion that, if we just put them on trial, everything will be okay. And I'm thinking, hey, there's much more to it than that. There's this sense that it's still the savior complex. Somebody's going to save us. We don't have to do anything. No. You become free when you realize that you can actually create the world you want, because you do anyway. When you just have to become conscious of the fact and consciously begin to realize and act as if you're living in the world you want to live in. It's a simple thing, and most people say, that doesn't sound right. And the reason why is because they've been spending their formative years listening to Walt Disney.
Well, exactly. It's like we have many teachings out there that teach us about, I teach imagination, will, and conviction, right? We have a lot of teachings out there that teach us to put our imagination and will into that future self, right? And to sit there and to kind of energetically vibe with that. But like you said, that dark side, if you will, has a great deal of success that we don't. And that's because they deliberately don't teach us the importance of action, right? Sometimes even if you take action without that solid or quite often, even if you take action without the solid imagination and will behind it, you still have the outcome because you've dropped the pebble in the pond. You've actually created the movement, right? And that's what they understand. And that's why, even though they're psychopathic and psychotic and all of these different things, they manifest anything that they want, and they control the outcome of the world because they understand that they're feeding our imagination for us, right?
Yes.
They're feeding our will, they're determining what is of value for us, and they're teaching us to not take any action, right? Just go meditate on the mountain, just go do the thing, ascend, get out of here, right?
Yeah.
Don't do anything. But it is that act of actually dropping the pebble in the pond, right? You can adjust the ripples, but you have to have dropped the pebbles to have created the ripples.
Yes. Yeah. No. It's something I want to ask you. I accept that the system created by the Draco has effectively collapsed. And, when you say the parents have checked out, what has happened to the covens? I mean, are there guys who, let's say, were close to the a particular parent and they were given the technique of how to live? They had to live for 200-300 years when they were asleep. And what I assume is what you see in the Star Wars movie, where the emperor where the acolyte kills the emperor, because you're going to have to kill that guy at some point, because he can't live for 4,000 years or whatever, you're going to have to get rid of him. Are there like errant covens still? I sometimes wonder if that's what we're seeing happening in Bakhmut and in Ukraine. There are these guys who are so accustomed to run amok that's what they're doing, because the overlords are no longer there. The kids have taken over in the crash, And I do wonder about that. I mean, I wonder if someone like Vicky Newland is a member of a coven, because that woman is fucking crazy. Well, it's like, hey, it's Wednesday, I have to find someone to kill.
What has happened is any of the coven members that were left definitely got absorbed by, the new structure, the umbrella corporation.
Yeah.
So yeah, I would say that those are the kind of the people in charge right now, in a sense, right?
Yes.
Yeah. And the other thing I wanted to comment on before I forget, actually, when you were talking about cartoons and you were talking about, this new organization, they call themselves the World Economic Forum. Yeah. And they talk about these young leaders, right?
Oh.
And so if you actually observe the behavior of any of these people, they act like cartoons. Their mannerisms, their vocal tones, they're not behaving like regular humans behave. They're behaving like an avatar would, or something like that. They're normalizing that to us. And so that's why those people are selected as, the focal point, the poster boy, the poster girl, the young leader, is because they're setting this new example of what the norm is, right?
Yes.
And it is cartoon world, which
right.
Is, yeah.
And in a way, it's not working, because you can look at Trudy and see that this guy's hanging on by a thread. And if this is not a nice thing to say, but if he jumped up in a desk in Parliament and started masturbating, it wouldn't surprise me. Jacinda Ardern has resigned. Why did she run afoul of Santa Claus or whatever? You can see that they're trying hard to keep things together, because I don't think that, take for example, someone like me, 100 years ago, 150 years ago, someone with a library of 3,000 books, a collection of, would be a scholar of some kind, an aristocrat. I'm an ordinary guy. And it's just a testament to the fact that what's ordinary now, 150 years ago, how can I put this? I don't think that they are keeping up with the rate of change within the population at large. They think they're leading us. But at some point, they're going to find out, oh shit, man, we are running as fast as we can, and we can't stay ahead of them. Like and at that point, they will do what they'll get desperate and try to push the red button. But it still won't work, because what they're dealing with is not the physical world alone, but this wonderful thing called human consciousness, the imagination, which we have. And they are trying to control it. It's like they're trying to control the wind by holding it and grabbing it. And it's like, guys, I'm sorry, but you're going to be disappointed.
Yeah, it's I actually, not too long ago had a conversation with one of them, and I pointed that out. I'm like, look at what the weather's doing. Nature is showing you that what you're planning ultimately won't work.
Yeah.
Right? Nature always will fight back. This planet does not belong to us. It belongs to her.
Yes.
She tolerates us. And
yes,
she
yes.
nurtures and helps us develop and grow. And that's what, our role here is to co-create along with that, right? Be a part of her imagination here.
Yes.
And, it's very much like those who try to bring about the end up delaying it, and those who try to delay it end up bringing it about, right? There are certain things that are governed by nature.
Yes.
And humans lost respect for that.
Yeah. Particularly those of us in the West, because we have believed our own propaganda, particularly around technology. Technology is in a way, is quite magical, but it's magical because it's based on our own magic, and we forget that. And it's, I just drew a blank. There's something else I wanted to say. It doesn't, we can do, well, I just went blank, my goodness. Maybe Red has infiltrated or CERN has found my frequency. Actually, one of the things I keep doing and when I think about that, I imagine that their frequencies being sent out, and you can block them and send them back to CERN or to Red. And it's like, hold on, there's a glitch in the matrix.
Called phasing, right? You identify the sound that's coming in this case, the frequency, the signal, you recreate it and you send it back.
Yes.
And the two can't occupy the same space, and what we end up with is nothing. So it's how I suggest to people to do it, is like our normal tendency, because it is almost like a sound, right? Like, let's just pretend, for sake of this conversation, we're hearing this, let's call it a high-pitched annoying sound. And our first reaction is like, make it stop, make it stop, make it stop. Listen, focus, blueprint it, figure out exactly what that sound is, be able to recreate it, because that's your weapon to fight back, right?
Yes.
Like, you need to be able to create an equal opposite weapon in order to push it away. And if we're afraid of it, if we're trying to hide from it and we're trying to run from it, then it's always going to end up winning. And
yeah, it's like, I have this idea about mosquitoes. Every time a mosquito comes around, it almost like makes your blood run cold. And I'm convinced that that's done specifically so that when you say your blood runs cold and send a shiver, it does something to your blood, which makes it attractive to them. And that's why they get that high-pitched sound in your, and you go, ooh. It's like, hey, now we have get the blood. Nature is wonderful, and nothing is ever wasted. Nothing is ever like, everything means something. And you have to figure it out. Like, mosquitoes just don't do that because they're annoying. They have to eat like everybody else.
Yeah, and those systems are exactly like, nature gives us the blueprint for everything in that way.
Yes.
I talk about possums with people because most people are scared to death of possums, but possums will literally not hurt you. You
Yeah.
know, BMO Field in Toronto. We had a possum in a garbage can. It was game time, so TSN's there, the TV cameras, everybody's rolling. Someone finds a possum in a garbage can at fieldside right before kickoff, and everyone's panicking because possums look vicious as hell, right? And nobody will do anything about it. So here I am. I'm in like the security office. I'm in a suit, like a full, suit and tie.
Yeah.
And I see this going on. I'm like, oh, come on, people. So I just get up, walk out down the tunnel, which I'm not supposed to do, out the players' tunnel, onto the field, walk over the garbage can, reach in, and I pick that thing up. And you just hear like there's like 30,000 people in the stadium. You just hear like a collective gasp because they think it's going to hurt me. And so I hold it up like this and I start sticking my fingers in its mouth.
Yeah.
You see what they do is they freeze and they make this really violent looking face. It's meant to scare you away. And the fact that they're not moving puts the thought into your head that it's like a cat ready to pounce. Right. But the bottom line is you can go up and pick that thing up and it will stay frozen. You can stick it, see your fingers in its mouth. It will not bite you because it doesn't. What it's doing is it's presenting optics of leave me alone. Right.
Right.
And our brain reacts to that in a fear mode. And we do that. Yeah.
Something I remember when I froze, what I was going to say. You had said that we now have they've basically gotten rid of the families, and we're going to now have everything be fascist because it will be run by corporations. But I have an addendum or an adjunct to say to that, because I had an experience. I'm walking down a hall, and this guy is a big guy, comes out and joins me. And there's a guy walking behind him, like an aide-de-camp. And this is the extent of the conversation. Hi, my name is. His last name is a place name in Canada. And for me, that's one of the characteristics of aristocracy. Your family would have had to be present. So he says, hi, my name is. My family came at the time of the revolution. And that was it. He obviously knew who I was. But I know that guy, there are multinational corporations who go to that guy to have him sign off on their projects. And if he doesn't sign off, the project doesn't get done. Because there are families around who, there are people with money. There are people who own money. There are people who have piles of money that when they want to start wars or revolutions or just whatever, they just take that money and throw it in the air and you have a war, whatever. Hedge funds, today's hedge funds are in part an iteration of that. So all this guy would have to do, his name doesn't have to appear in a paper, but the people who run the company would know when you receive a call from you stand at attention. All you would have to do is to make a call to the CEO or the chairman and says, this project goes ahead. Because the hedge fund, the seed money from that hedge fund would have been made 200 years ago from that big pile of money. And that's the way it's done. So at a certain level, because you see, the family is the basic organizing unit of the species. And I don't think, although you'd have a corporation or corporations running it, running administering the power structure, I do still think that at some point you're going to have families. They may not be able to trace their lineages back to the parents, but you will still, or they may have a tangential connection to that. But I do think that you will have families, if only because there are families who can trace their lineage back thousands of years, and that's a real power. My brother in Toronto knows a woman in Toronto who is a descendant of the Ptolemies, who ran Egypt at some point. Now, if you have that, they say knowledge is power, and it is. If you know who you are, you can project that kind of power to people, and people will respect it. So this guy, how did he know who I was? My family came at the time of the revolution. So we own souls.
And this is part of the change now, because with where the world's going, that old structure of like the family name and that lineage and all of that is more frequently becoming irrelevant, right? Like
Yes.
they don't need it anymore, especially with
Mhm.
like the way that they're going to start augmenting genetics in terms of making designer children and designer humans, and like that is the reaction solution to all the damage that they've done to our genetics, right? Is to, oh, okay, well, we have a solution, we'll just make you all in labs then. Oh, you can't produce babies naturally, that's okay, because we have artificial wombs and we have CRISPR, so we're good to go, right? We can repopulate that way. So yeah, it's problem and solution. I think that that particular order, if you will,
Mhm.
uh, because of the reasons you said, that's kind of inherently flawed, right? Because you end up
Mhm.
with dynasties and empires that are really hard to remove. You can't cancel them, right? And I think this umbrella corporation kind of recognizes that it's really hard, right? Like, just imagine if it is just a family, like the old Draco structure, and we'll use two obvious ones, like a Rothschild and a Rockefeller, and
Yeah.
they're at war against each other. Well, that means that everyone else has to deal with that. Whereas
Yes.
today, if it's like, IBM and Dell, then
Yeah.
like, whichever one is more woke and more in line with the global agenda and whatnot gets the support of everybody, and the other one just disappears, right? So
Right.
they couldn't do that with families and those family structures and all those ties, because of the reasons you said, that like physical wealth, right? The money that was made years ago,
Yeah.
that used to matter. Where we're moving now with everything being digital, the value of all of that goes away, right? And therefore you can't have a system that is constantly, turning over the deep state, if you will, without having to repeat that old system. So that's a lot of why they're moving in the directions that they are, is so that it makes it so that we never have one person who gets stuck in power for thousands of years and goes on their own tirade and decides to do their own thing. If you don't toe the line, there's the door, right?
Right. 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 I, my goodness, I still think that, see what's going to happen. I can well see these families, because if it comes to a question of survival, and I sometimes wonder if that's what we're seeing in the Ukraine, it's families fighting. Because if you're going to tell someone, like the Sassoon family, who can trace the lineage back to Sumer, that no, we're going to get rid of you and we're going to get your wealth, they're not going to go quietly into the good night. They're
Exactly.
going to recall all of their connections, which go for generations, hundreds, if not thousands of years, and come after you. And I think before, you might have the umbrella corporation, but we're going to have a lot of internecine wars, which are like people trying to say, listen, you can't get rid of me just like that. Because, I mean, you mean that what we have done for 4,000 or 5,000 years doesn't matter, you know?
Well, if you listen really closely to the rhetoric being used with the current war, that's exactly what's going on, right? It's all of the oligarchs and all of these
Yes.
families and all these dynasties who are
Yeah.
basically, supporting one side, and all
Yeah.
these corporations are supporting the other side. I mean,
Yes.
it's symbolic, of course, because we know what the outcome is, but what you're saying is exactly part of that symbology of like, these are the old families, the old oligarchies, like family
Yes.
structures. This is
Yeah.
the old Illuminati version, right? The Draco
Yes. Yeah.
Empire.
Yeah.
And this is the Umbrella Corporation, right? And so like NATO versus BRICS is kind of what we're calling it in one sense.
Yes. Yes.
The reality is that's what it is. It's the symbolic war between the old and the new, so that the new can claim victory over the old, right?
Right, and that establishes the reality of the new world, in that, well, the BRICS are now the orthodoxy.
Exactly. It's like the grandfather system, because we do still have a lot of those people who are used to that old way, right? We
Yes.
need to like grandfather them out, if you will, right? And so you you give them enough to keep them happy, keep them quiet. It's
Yeah.
the same thing that happens in any, like, religion or science, especially, right? Like, the new ideas aren't accepted because they're correct. New ideas are accepted because the old people died off, right? So that's
True.
kind of exactly where that is right now. It's like, you're going to be grandfathered this little spot where you can still do what you've always done. We're going to do what we're going to do now, and we're just going to wait for you guys to all die off and replace you with cyborgs. It's going to be fine. It'll take some time, but it'll be fine.
One other thing I'd like to mention, and it has to do with China, and people think of China as being the new emerging force on the planet. But one of the things I've noticed is that what we call China today has very little to do with Chinese culture, Chinese history, Chinese mindsets. All these guys are products of the same people who, in the 1800s, wanted to capture China and had the Opium War, and they were rebuffed. They didn't go quietly. They just sit and say, okay, how can we get at this? Oh, I know, we'll get them all scholarships, send them to France, make them communist, and they'll go back and run the country.
Yeah.
For us.
Yeah, everyone forgets that all happened with China, that it was basically like, it was like cutting off the head of one dragon and replacing it with another one. Is essentially what happened. Yeah.
Yes.
And well, what we see today is like 200 years later, right? So it's a lot changed, but
it's the old saying, the more things
way older, right? Sorry, I started to talk over you. We kind of got mixed up there, but the root of that culture is like 9,000 years old. The United States is like 400 years old, right?
I once had a conversation with a lady, and she said, "Oh, you seem like an emotional guy." And then she began to talk to me as people will, and she said she was going to be a senior person in the US Embassy in Beijing. And she said, we know that the Chinese know where they're going to be in 50 years. We don't know where we're going to be in 6 months. What we're trying to do is to tell them, when they get ready to shaft us, please use Vaseline.
I used to always make this joke that if they ever wanted to, they could really just put Chinese people in boats in the middle of the night and row them over to America and take over,
Yeah.
It's been funny because I've had a lot of people, especially I have a lot of friends in the American military, a lot of like kickback against my view of like where China is versus where the United States is in terms of the military. But then that fucking balloon happened, and I was like, guys, what's hilarious, and I've been trying so desperately because like myself and a bunch of other people knew this because we were following it. But so CP24 in Toronto, they've redacted it. They've taken it all down. They've scrubbed it from their website, but they were reporting that Chinese spy balloon here in Canada probably 4 or 5 hours before it ever crossed the border to the United States, because China had called Canada, the Canadian embassy, to let them know that one of their surveillance balloons, which was from Canada, had dropped altitude, got caught in an air current, and blown down to the States. So they had actually let Canada know first, so that Canada could be the one to warn the States, right? Because the way the deal is Canada has a deal with the Chinese military that they're allowed to run these exercises in our country, right? But there's a border there. And so this exercise, they ran across that border, and they're like, well, fuck, now we have it, right? And I could just imagine China just laughing. Like, this is hilarious. Hilarious.
Yeah, it's again going back to China and the umbrella corporation, because the East India Company, which I think is what it was called, at the height of its power, and I think it still exists, but in another name today, it controlled 200,000 soldiers. And I think at the time the British had like 80,000. When there's a doctor in Israel who signed who said that the deal that Pfizer signed with the Israeli government was done 2 years before the pandemic. What I'd like to know is some Jewish lawyer to look at that deal and see which clause gives Pfizer operational control of Shin Bet, the Mossad, or the IDF. Because remember, I told you that Pfizer was kicked out of Brazil because they wanted as collateral access to the embassies and the military bases. And I thought, well, what does that? But you can see if the people behind this project have long enough memories and remember what the East India Company was like and that they controlled a large fighting force, you can see how they can say, okay, well, this is how we can do it. We can sign a deal with Israel, say, or Brazil, or maybe even the United States, Canada, and, with the right circumstance and action and clause in this deal, it's a legal document, we then get operational control of these military. And of course, the soldiers will still salute the emblems of the state and they'll still talk about sovereignty. But it's like that guy whose family came at the time of revolution. If the CEO of Pfizer calls the chief of staff of Mossad or the IDF, he says, okay, well, we have to send a contingent of soldiers to Mali to steal gold or something, to defend our gold or something. And I think that is coming. Well, hold on, that's here. That's the reality in which we live. Because if this past couple of days, Ursula van der Crazy, as some people call her, went to England and spoke to Richie Sunak. Richie Sunak is such a little sniveling shit. Sorry. Spoke to him and the king, and they have effectively squashed Brexit. And the reason why the Queen was against it was because when soldiers salute, they won't be saluting to Her Majesty or to the sovereign. They'll be saluting to some corporate guy who thinks that the world is a garden and a jungle in Brussels. And she wasn't going to stand for it. And Charles, Charles is not too bright, is he? He goes, sorry, my sovereign. I'm a monarchist of all things. But it's really interesting to sit and see the game being played out. And I have an idea I told you I didn't think that the dust will settle until maybe around 2075. We'll have a clear idea of who has won. It won't be any clear-cut victory because as always, it will be competing forces. One force will be up one day, another will be up. But anything can happen now. And we have seen that, man, they've done a real number on the English people. They've told us, well, you do have a vote and it counts and it's on, but when you get right down to it, that saying money talks and politicians walk. I'm sorry.
No, it makes
We
sense.
live in interesting times.
Well, exactly, right? And it's all by design. I mean, this is the apocalypse, right? This is the end of times. Like, we have a bunch of different words for it. It will seem like a dark ages, right? But
yes,
my analogy for it, it's to bring it back into nature, this is the planet giving birth. It's been pregnant for a really long time, and now the hips are widening, the pelvis is moving apart, it's getting ready to spit out this baby of a new world. And that's, if you've ever watched childbirth, it's a pretty brutal, destructive process.
Yes,
absolutely miraculous, beautiful outcome, right?
Yes.
So that's the way I'm kind of looking at this. Is the birthing is messy, it's bloody,
Yes,
it's gross, right? But then you have that beautiful screaming baby in your hands, and you see that all that potential, and it makes it all right.
Yes. I have a feeling that we're coming at the denouement of this conversation. Just a feeling I have. I got to say what I wanted to say about the connectivity we have, synchronicity, stillbirth ideas, communism. I'm not a communist. I remember, you know, I was reading, I think it's Das Kapital, and I threw it away at the first chapter. Because I could see that the guy, Marx, he was filled of resentment, and he was pouring that resentment into his work. And then later I wrote that, you know, he had been jilted at 26, and he just took all that resentment. And that's what's, and I'm supposed to take this seriously? It's like, come on. But we have, as you say, you know, ideas can be, there can be stillbirth in ideas, and there can be beautiful ideas, but all beautiful ideas, as you say, have the dark and light. That's what makes us human. We can't deny the fact that there's an element of hubris and ignorance and blindness to human experience. And we have to accept that, because, you know, it's, you know, as Christians say, therefore the grace of God goes on. You know? And it's better to try and understand your enemy or your purported enemy as a projection of yourself than someone you have to defeat, you know, because you are as capable of doing what he or she is doing as they are, you know. And it behooves us to be gentle with ourselves and gentle with the world, because I mean, I know that forgiveness is an extremely powerful tool, a healing tool. And I mean, there's room for, you know, unleash the dogs of war, chop their heads off. But when that's over, if you cannot sit down and realize the blood you've spilt is part of who and what you are, you know, then what's the point?
Yeah, it's you know, they have an us and them mentality, which is exactly why they've built everything the way that it is. And
Yes.
so for us to adopt the equal opposite us and them mentality isn't solving the problem.
Exactly.
Right? Jesus said to, you know, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yes. Yes. No.
And that
It's
doesn't
true.
necessarily mean we excuse it all, and that doesn't necessarily mean we tolerate or enjoy or respect it all. But we have to learn how to love it all so that we can understand it. Because if
Yes.
we don't understand it, then we're not going to be able to fix it. It's like that Ender Game quote, like, in the moment where I'm ready to, I'm going to paraphrase it, in the moment when I'm ready to destroy my enemy, I also love him because I understand him. I had to gain the understanding of him to get to that point. And, you
Right.
know, that's the difference between a psychopath and an empath
Right.
is, you know, one will make you want to control them, want to own them, want to, you know, exploit them.
Mhm.
The other
Mhm.
one will make you realize that you do love them.
Yes. Yes. And, you know, I don't know where I got it from. It might be how I was indoctrinated and something slipped through. But I do believe that love is the greatest good on the planet. And I've seen it, it's tough because the world, we have been taught wrongly that love is pointless. And when you live in a world where everyone agrees on a lie, telling the truth or bearing witness to the truth can be painful. But, you know, the light always outshines the dark. You have to um, let your light shine. You know? And
Exactly.
mhm.
The idea, like, we have a tendency to want to eliminate the dark. Why not just shine brighter, right? We need shadow. We need shadow to find depth. We need shadow to see edges. We need shadow, right? So
Yes,
it's not
yes,
necessarily that we want it gone. We just need to make sure that the balance is correct so that we're
yes.
seeing things properly.
That's really interesting. One of the images in the show that I curated is it's it's a fabric artist, so she uses a machine. The machine was made in 1941, and that has something to do with what she could have done or what she could do. And there's an image where, imagine this is a piece of cloth, there's just something, and then here you have this, and this represents the person. Hold on. This represents the person, which is, and that represents the shadow. The shadow is actually larger than the person. And I think that that is so telling, because the shadow also always takes on a life of its own and becomes belligerent when it's not acknowledged.
Peter Pan.
Hey.
I use that analogy when I teach the magic course too, because Peter Pan lost his shadow and he was so desperate to get that thing back because he was still a child and he understood how important that was to him. And then if you actually watch the shadows alerting him to danger, it's telling him of things of value. It's, they have an interaction, they have a relationship. We don't do that with ourselves anymore. We want to, deny that shadow. We want to oppress it. We want to keep it locked up in a closet instead of inviting it over for coffee and having a nice conversation.
Something just occurred to me. A lot of that is the result of the work of Freud,
Absolutely.
Yeah, that guy.
That's my family's influence on your world, is to get rid of Carl Jung and bring Freud to the forefront.
Yeah, I have come to regard him as, because I've read most of the stuff. I remember sitting I went to Erindale College, and I'm sitting in the back of the room, and it's a psychology course. And by that time, I'd read Ernest Jones' biography of him. I've read all the works and everything. And I'm thinking, there's something about this guy which is not right. Can't quite put my finger on it. But I wouldn't be surprised now if someone were to tell me, well, he would go to these meetings and they tell him what to say or what to do or what to write. Because as you say, Carl Jung, and you can always tell the person who is the truth teller, he's the one who gets kicked out of the group, ostracized, hey, you're not towing the line. And, Carl was that. You can argue, well, because most of these guys around Freud, like Otto Rank and so on, they were Jewish, and Carl Jung wasn't. And you can say, well, that's it. But that wasn't it. It was the ideas.
You can also tell the difference between, to use a spiritual term, Freud is a much lower frequency.
Yes.
Right? Like a much lower, like there's, Jung got into, the subconscious mansion, the unconscious mind, the collective unconsciousness, all of those different things, the shadow, and it was too close. That's essentially what it was, is like families like mine looked at that, was like, fuck, if we leave that out there, people are going to get the wrong ideas. So we need to give them something else. And that's where Freud came from. And it was a combination of yes, his own research and his own brilliance, but being propped up by people who wanted those ideas to be kind of there. Exactly, right. And then, as it happens with anyone, you start putting colleagues in place to Freud, who then subtly influence him as well to make sure that the conclusions are all what you want them to be. And 100 years later, you have a whole society based on Freudian psychology that is broken.
Oh my goodness. Which is why psychiatrists prescribe, because his method of just talking, it has value, because that's what people do with me. They come and they tell me their stories. But the structure of medical therapy is that you have to keep doing that for 20 visits so you can make some money and so on. You only need to tell them.
Re-traumatize your client. Every three sessions, you're taught to re-traumatize them. That's part of why you keep them talking about the same thing, because you're triggering them every time you do it. It's like, it's not implied, like we're doing this so that they keep coming back. But if you read between the lines, you're doing that so that they keep coming back, right?
Yeah.
You're trying to help them. And it's built right into the education and right into the system of how it all works. And then, because that does not work, the result is then pharma, right? Medication. Alter your brain chemistry. That'll fix everything.
One of the things I've done here is I've tried to source all of my food directly from people who grow, like my potatoes, my tomatoes, everything, pumpkin. They're grown, I'm in walking distance of where they're grown. I was given a lift yesterday by a guy and say, yeah, I can arrange for you to have fish. Because one of the things you realize, the incidence of cancer and other diseases and obesity on this island has just exploded. And it's because when the Four Seasons, bless their little hearts, came here 30 years ago, they decided to feed the staff, which meant that, as the saying goes, all the women turned their pots down. We didn't have to, but they were feeding them North American food with all these hormones and so on. And you see people now, they look like North Americans, they're lumbering, which is so ironic because we are small framed, but we carry this weight. So the women, you have these women with very narrow. My mom at 29 was 90 pounds. My dad, when she got married, my dad as an adult was 5'11", 140 plus with a 30-inch waist. But if you start eating a lot of American junk food, where do all that stuff goes? So you have these very unusual looking people. And so partly because when I was born here, that's how we lived. If you had chicken, it was, hey, hold that chicken. Is the water on? You pluck the feathers, you wring the neck. Hey, it's life, somebody has to break the neck. Like I saw a cat got knocked down outside my gate, and this guy, he's obviously in North America. It's been lying in the street, and he stops and he takes the cat and puts it on the side. Cat doesn't really care. It's dead. There's a kind of harshness and bluntness to reality here, because you see nature unadorned. You see sheep and goats with the afterbirth hanging out, because it just gave birth. You see a cock literally flying over a fence trying to tread a hen. That's life, that's reality. It's so I'm trying to ground myself in nature. I mean, I still do. I don't eat ice cream anymore, but I still do have my little. I still eat biscuits and so on, but try to make sure that what I eat, the fruits I eat, and it's so sad, they're now, because we've become so Americanized, you can go down the street and find trees which are laden with fruit, which will eventually rot and drop on the ground because the kids no longer eat them. And what I realized when I was growing up, you can get a banana anytime you want in Toronto, or fruit, but fruits grow in season, and that's how they should be eaten because it allows your body to recycle itself and so on. It's been quite. I came here on a 6-month contract, and within 3 days I knew I couldn't return to Toronto, and I have no rational explanation. And it has happened to several people, and it's. Anyway, we can go on and on.
Well, I think we can wrap it up for today, but
yes, we can.
Yeah, that's that nature is there to show us these things, and humans have made the mistake of trying to remove themselves from it. And there needs to be a balance. Like, we have to kind of be in harmony with her, and when we're not, there's a lot of negative kickbacks, and unfortunately, yes, that's the price that we're paying right now. And it is what it is. And like I said, birthing's messy, but we're gonna have this beautiful baby there eventually, and that'll make it all worth it.
Yes, and I do think that there are some lessons which can only be learned through experience. And we have to experience as a community, as a human family, certain things so that we become certain in our minds or subconscious mind of what not to do in the future, because that will lead us off the cliff, or that does not work. And there's certain deep, profound lessons which can only be learned via experience. Some of them are like wars, some of the most peaceful people in the world are people who have been in war. Not peaceful, I mean people who value and know the importance of resolving conflict through negotiation. People who have killed and seen people being killed and know that there has to be a better way, there has to be another way. And so I think that what we are going through, the dark ages, as I call it, or the being ruled by a corporation, is that so that we can see and feel in our bones that this wasn't as great as an idea as we thought it would be.
Well said. Well
Yeah.
said. All right, brother. Lots of love and respect. We'll say
Same
bye.
to you. Okay.